Hi, everyone. Today, I wanted to do something different. I'm not actually going to do a rum review today because what I want to do is to introduce something that is very close to my heart, but which has fallen somewhat into disuse by the members of the group that we founded back in 2014. Now, this was a group that we called the Rumaniacs. And at the time when a number of us met in Paris, this was Daniel Biondi, it was myself, it was Cyril Werglers from Durham, it was Serge Valentin from Whiskey Fun, and Luca Gargano. At the time, the reason why we all got together is because, by some strange coincidence, all of us were in Paris at the same time. And I was there for, I think it was pretty much in March or April of that year. And we got together because we were all attending the Paris Rum Fest that year. And Luca got us all together, and we met in La Maison du Whisky. And he made a suggestion. He liked the idea of reviewers who had had some stature in the rum world at that time. There weren't that many of us, and many of them, of course, were in Europe. I was one of the few that wasn't. And he wanted to have us talk about old rums, and specifically rums from his collection. At the time, we had no clue how big that collection actually was. It's like a pilgrimage to Mecca for rum people, let me tell you. I've been there, so I can tell you that for a fact. But here's the thing. He wanted the knowledge of these things not to be forgotten. So what he proposed to us was that he would send one person, a central person, a bottle from his collection. That person would sample them out and send them to us, and we would write about them. Now, if you know Serge Valentin, and if you knew Daniel in his day before he started working for Velier, you'll know that these guys wrote fairly brief reviews. I was one of the few people at the time who started to put in a little bit more. I started to add things like the history of the distillery, something of the background of the company, the people who were involved, any contextual matters that I felt were important. So I loved the idea because I've been a history aficionado since I was in high school. I deliberately went in for history classes. I have read about politics and history, ancient, modern, Middle Ages, Eastern, Western, Southern, Northern. I've read it all because it fascinates me. It's history of the world. And of course, when you translate that into my new interest, which was rums, you can understand why this thing was so important to me. I felt it wasn't just interesting in and of itself, but important. And years later, when I spoke to the guys at the Rumcast, I made this point yet again. I think that we ignore this kind of stuff at our peril because it's so difficult to do the research right. At the time, the internet was no better. It was not as good as it is now. In fact, it was worse. And of course, it was really difficult to get any kind of information from anybody short of picking up the phone and making a transatlantic phone call or something and getting the information. Here we had a chance for the first time in rum writing history, if you will, to actually get information from distillers, from people who knew the brands, older people, younger people. I mean, there's just a lot of information out there now. And as a consequence, this idea just lit a fire under me. And I thought this was one of the best ideas I'd ever heard. Now, the arrangement was supposed to be the following. One, Luca didn't want to be involved in the sense that he didn't want his name to be mentioned. And he said he didn't want to do that because he felt that his commercial interests might, sort of like impact how people saw the reviews if they knew he was the one who was supplying them. Because perhaps people would feel, well, he's just sending us stuff that he himself makes in order to get a good review. He actually didn't do that. He sent us quite a lot from all over the map, but there was no question that he wanted to avoid any appearance of impropriety. And as a consequence, he didn't want his name mentioned at all. However, since he has now issued his autobiography, both in Italian and in English, and that particular event is mentioned there, it's no longer that much of a secret. And in any case, sadly enough, the whole idea has now stopped. And I've never been entirely sure why. This is like, the samples stopped coming like about 6, 7 years ago. We did keep it up. We did get the samples. We did write about them, very contextually speaking. We did the history and whatever tasting notes we had, and we talked a little bit about it, and it's out there. And there was even a Romaniacs website for a while, although that's now dead, probably because the fees weren't paid or it just wasn't maintained or whatever the case was. But even through all these years, I've loved the idea and I've continued it on my own account. I mean, the Romaniacs isn't copyrighted, it isn't trademarked or anything like that. It's just a name that we came up with at that meeting. And we talked about it, settled on that. And that's what it became. And of course, in my website, I have a whole section of all the rums that are Romaniacs rums in. But what has happened, of course, is that after the samples stopped coming, because I like the idea so much, any old rum that didn't have any antecedents, it didn't wasn't made by any company now extant. I got minis, I got older rums, I got stuff from way back when. I mean, that's just like the perfect place for them, right? I mean, you don't have to write an actual review and talk to people about it. You do your research on the quiet with whatever materials you have on hand, and you write about the background. In point of fact, the background is often more information or more interesting than the rum itself. I mean, rums from ago were made at 40%, 37%, 38%, 41%, and they really often weren't that interesting. The 70s were particularly bad about that. Oh, just don't want to talk about that, right? But because what I want to do is start doing videos about rums that I have written about in my website, and that's like however many it is, like 1,000 or whatever. There is that whole section of about 100 plus that qualify as Romaniacs rums. And when you really think about it, every rum that we drink today is going to be a Romaniacs rum of the future, right? But whatever. The thing is, I don't want to ignore them just because they aren't current and because I don't have a bottle on me. It's all been samples, right? So it's kind of like a little rinky-dink bottle, and you label it and you talk about it. And I want to do that some more because I don't think we should ignore the stuff that isn't being made anymore. Sooner or later, there's going to be a new crop of writers, of vloggers, of people who are interested in the subject and who want to do some research. This might be the only chance we get to put that information out in front of them. And you know what? There's a whole bunch of people, younger people, bartenders and stuff. They want to know the history going back a ways. For the most part, we're lucky if we get rums from the 70s and 80s these days. I've been fortunate enough to find some from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, even a few from way before that. And I think that the history that it is that they represent about how rum developed, how the industry developed, the way things were back then, the sort of ways they did production, the stills that they had, the people who were involved, and so on. I think that is something of great value to amateur historians like myself, people who are interested in the subject and who want to know more. They're not really geeks; they're just interested in the subject, like I am. And therefore, there will be occasional Romaniacs reviews where I want to talk about this. And what this little video is for is simply to introduce the whole concept rather than tack it on at the beginning of the first Romaniacs review and then never mention it again. This is something interesting in and of itself. And I hope that those who follow me and the writing that myself and so many others have done over the years do find it interesting. The rums that I talk about have, of course, been written about, but there will be others in the future because I have a whole raft of them from the 2024 German Rum Festival, where I spent literally hours in front of two of the stalls that had nothing but out of production rums. And I knew why I did that because it was so important to me. And I hope one day that you find it important, at the very least interesting as well. So that's it for here. And this is an introduction, and we will get started soon. Thanks for listening and have a really nice day. Take care. Bye bye.